A 9-year-old girl was murdered in Spokane, Washington. Her killer was never charged, never arrested, never even suspected. And for 62 years, his name did not appear in a single police report. Not one. What finally exposed him was a decision made by an unknown investigator. Stay with me, because this starts on a Friday afternoon that looked completely ordinary. March 6, 1959, Spokane, Washington. Candy Rogers is 9 years old. She weighs 60 pounds. She stands 4 feet 4 inches tall. It is the first day of the Campfire Girls mint selling season. She had one goal for the afternoon: sell enough mints to earn a sales badge, maybe qualify for a free week of summer camp. She could only carry 7 boxes. She was too small for more. Before she left, she sat with her grandmother. She played with her dog Shep. She talked through which neighbors she was going to visit first. She was not nervous. She was not excited. At exactly 4 p.m., Candy Rogers walked out her front door and started knocking on doors. She never came back through it. By 5:30 p.m., the street lights were coming on. Candy knew the rule. Every kid on that block knew the rule. Be home before the lights come on. When 5:30 passed with no sign of her, her grandfather went outside. He checked the neighbors. He walked the block. Nobody had seen her recently. Her mother, Elaine, arrived home from a hair appointment to find her daughter was not there. Within the hour, family members were out on the street searching. By nightfall, police had been called. Now here is what made tracing her path almost impossible. That same Friday evening, dozens of other Campfire Girls were out in the same neighborhood. Same uniforms, same boxes, same routes. Witnesses thought they remembered seeing a girl, but they could not confirm. Which girl was Candy? The trail was already blurring before the search had even properly begun. At around 9 p.m., searchers found something on Pettit Drive, a road that climbs a hill locals call Doomsday Hill. Campfire mint boxes scattered across the ground. Not dropped. Scattered. The pattern was consistent with boxes thrown from a moving vehicle window, thrown fast, thrown while driving away. The trail of boxes led south, across the Fort George Wright Bridge, away from Candy's neighborhood. Investigators recovered one box with a partial fingerprint on it. It was carefully lifted, preserved, sent directly to the FBI. It was never identified. By 9 p.m. on March 6, 1959, one thing was no longer in question. Candy Rogers had not wandered off. She had not gotten lost. Someone had taken her. By the morning of March 7th, Spokane had mobilized. 1,200 people showed up to search for one little girl. Marines, Boy Scouts, mail carriers, horseback riders, utility workers. The U.S. Air Force deployed helicopters for aerial coverage of the search area. They had no GPS, no cell phones, no surveillance cameras. They had scattered mint boxes, one unidentified partial fingerprint, and a trail that ended at the edge of a bridge. Then the search claimed its own casualties. On March 7th, just one day after Candy disappeared, a U.S. Air Force helicopter flying low over the search corridor struck high-tension power lines. It crashed into the Spokane River. 3 crew members were killed. Airman Marles D. Ray, Staff Sergeant William A. McDonald, Lieutenant Kenneth G. Fout. 2 others survived. 3 men died, searching for one child. The city was grieving in 2 directions at once, and Candy had still not been found. 16 days went by. On March 21st, 2 airmen from Fairchild Air Force Base were hunting in a wooded area off Old Trails Road, about 7 miles from Candy's home. Moving through the trees near an abandoned rock quarry, they noticed something at the base of a tree, a pair of small girls' shoes. Placed there. Not tossed, not fallen, placed. They went back to base and reported it immediately. The next morning, a search party arrived at first light. Within minutes, one of the searchers pushed aside a pile of brush and pine needles and found Candy Rogers. She had been concealed under branches and dead tree boughs, approximately 50 yards from the road. The medical examiner determined the cause of death was strangulation. The ligature used was a strip of cloth torn from Candy's own clothing. Her feet had been bound with another strip from the same garment. Medical examiners also documented evidence of a physical violation that compounded the severity of the crime. Every item of clothing, every piece of physical evidence found at that scene, all of it was carefully catalogued, labeled, and preserved. The investigators working that case in 1959 had no concept of DNA analysis, no framework for genetic evidence, no reason to think about what biology could tell a future lab. But they preserved it anyway. And that instinct is the only thread that connects March 1959 to the answer that came 62 years later. The investigators in 1959 had no idea what future technology could do with what they were saving. But they were about to hand detectives the wrong suspect, and it would take 40 years to realize the mistake. Cases like this one take nearly 15 days of research per episode. Court records, forensic lab reports, declassified investigative files, real genealogy methodology explained accurately. That is what every episode on this channel is built on. If that level of depth is what you are here for, hit subscribe right now. For 40 years, detectives believed they had their man. They had a name, a criminal history, a piece of evidence that seemed to connect everything. The case felt solid. It was completely wrong. And the cost of that mistake was 4 decades of investigation pointed in the wrong direction. Here is how it happened. His name was Hugh Bion Morse. Serial predator, active in the Spokane area, known to law enforcement. 4 years before Candy's murder, Morse had been caught in California, attempting to molest 2 Girl Scouts who were selling cookies door to door. Let that sit for a second. Young girls, selling things door to door, targeted by this man. Then less than a year after Candy was found, Morse raped and murdered 2 women in Spokane. He crossed state lines. He kept moving. He kept offending. He was finally caught in Minnesota in 1961 after a neighbor recognized his face from an FBI wanted poster. He died in a Minnesota prison in April 2003, serving 2 life sentences. The profile matched Candy's case almost perfectly. The geography matched. The timing matched. The method of targeting matched. To investigators building this picture across multiple decades, Hugh Morse was the answer. What they did not know yet was that one small, untested detail was holding the entire theory together. And that detail was wrong. At almost every crime scene linked to Morse, investigators recovered grape-flavored gum. Not once, not twice. Consistently enough, across enough locations, that it became a known signature. A behavioral marker tied directly to him. Now go back to Candy's 1959 autopsy. A detective examining her clothing noted a stain. Purple in color. And when that stain was examined more closely, it had a grape smell. That observation was written down, filed, preserved alongside everything else, and it was never tested. No chemical analysis, no lab confirmation, no verification of what that stain actually was. It was logged as an observation, and over time, it became something far more powerful than that. It became assumed evidence. As Morse's profile as a killer grew clearer across the years, that grape stain moved from a detective's note to the centerpiece of the case against him. Every investigator who inherited this file inherited that assumption along with it. For 40 years, the grape stain pointed every fresh set of eyes directly at Hugh Morse. Nobody stopped to test it. Nobody questioned whether the assumption was sound. It just hardened. Then came 2001. Detective Mindy Connolly submitted Candy's preserved clothing to a forensic laboratory. Scientists worked through the evidence and isolated a semen sample. For the first time in 42 years, investigators had something real. Not an assumption, not a behavioral profile, not a stain with a smell. An actual biological profile. They ran it against Hugh Bion Morse. It did not match. The grape stain meant nothing. The parallel crimes meant nothing. The geography meant nothing. The DNA said no. And in forensic science, DNA does not negotiate. 4 decades of near certainty collapsed in a single lab result. Hugh Morse did not kill Candy Rogers. The real killer had never been identified, had never been suspected, had never even been looked at. And nobody knew where to look next. The biological profile built from that sample was uploaded to the CODIS, the National DNA Database. CODIS holds profiles from convicted offenders, arrestees, and unidentified crime scene samples from across the United States. The search ran 0 hits. Complete silence. The real killer had never been arrested for any offense requiring a DNA sample submission. He had never appeared in a tip, never surfaced in a witness statement, never been named in a police report. Not once. Not in 62 years of active investigation. He had lived in the same city as Candy Rogers. He had breathed the same air as the investigators searching for him. And his name had never come up. Not anywhere. With CODIS exhausted, and every traditional investigative lead long since closed, the only remaining option was forensic genetic genealogy. In 2020, the DNA sample was submitted to a private genealogy laboratory. The lab examined what remained of the biological material. Their answer came back quickly. Too degraded. Case declined. That was not a minor setback. That was the last door closing. CODIS had returned nothing. Every conventional lead was gone. The only lab willing to attempt genealogy had just turned the case away. If forensic genealogy could not be done with what remained of that sample, Candy Rogers would stay unsolved. Permanently. The only thing still standing between this case and a permanent cold case file was a glass mason jar sealed shut in 1959 by someone whose name we do not even know. They were out of options, out of databases, out of labs willing to try. And then someone told Brittany Wright about a laboratory in Texas that specialized in exactly the kind of work everyone else had already refused. Before we get to the Texas lab, before we get to the DNA match, before we get to the name, we need to talk about a decision made by an unknown investigator in 1959. Because without that one decision, none of what follows happens. At some point during the evidence collection, following Candy's discovery in March 1959, someone took a piece of biological evidence, placed it inside a glass mason jar, and sealed it shut. No label explaining why glass specifically, no note about long-term preservation, no awareness of what DNA even was. Just a sealed jar, placed in an evidence locker, and left there. Here is why that matters. Glass is chemically inert. It does not degrade over time. It does not absorb moisture from its contents. It does not interact with biological material stored inside it. Plastic breathes. Paper absorbs. Standard evidence bags, over decades, allow microscopic environmental exchange. Glass does none of that. That airtight seal, created in an era with zero knowledge of genetic science, produced a near-perfect preservation environment for over 6 decades. When forensic scientists eventually opened that jar, the DNA inside was not just detectable, it was strong enough to build a full profile. That is not luck. That is the result of one careful decision made by someone whose name the record does not show on a morning in 1959 when the only priority was doing the job right. Everything that follows exists because of that jar. Brittany Wright grew up in Spokane. As a child, her parents talked about Candy Rogers, not as a news story they had followed, not as a local legend, as a warning. Zelimo, watch where you go. Remember what happened to that little girl. Wright grew up. She went into forensic science. She joined the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory Division. And in 2018, Candy's case file landed on her desk. The timing of that moment was not random. In 2018, California investigators announced the arrest of Joseph James D'Angelo, the Golden State Killer, a serial rapist and murderer who had evaded identification for 40 years. The technique that identified him was called forensic genetic genealogy. It had never been used to solve a case of that scale before. The arrest made international news overnight, and within weeks, law enforcement agencies across the United States were pulling their oldest unsolved cases off shelves and asking the same question. Could this work for us? Spokane asked that question about Candy Rogers. Immediately. Before we go further, it is worth taking 60 seconds to understand exactly how this technique works. Because this is not guesswork. This is not circumstantial. This is methodology. Forensic genetic genealogy works like this. You take crime scene DNA and you run it through consumer ancestry databases, platforms where ordinary people upload their genetic profiles to find family connections. The crime scene DNA does not need to match anyone directly. It only needs to partially match distant relatives, cousins, second cousins, third cousins, people who share enough genetic markers to indicate a common ancestor. Once those partial matches are identified, trained genealogists go to work. They build family trees, branch by branch, generation by generation. They cross-reference public records, birth certificates, marriage records, census data, obituaries, military service records. They eliminate candidates who do not fit the age, location, or gender profile of the unknown suspect. And they keep narrowing until the tree points to one name. That is what identified the Golden State Killer after 4 decades of silence. The question for Brittany Wright in 2018 was whether the evidence in Candy's case was still viable enough to run that process. The answer to that question almost ended everything. The DNA sample, while better preserved than it had any right to be, had still degraded significantly over 60 years. It also carried his non-human biological contamination, material that had mixed into the sample over decades and complicated any attempt at clean analysis. In 2020, Wright submitted what remained of the sample to a private forensic genealogy laboratory. The lab examined it. Their response came back. Too degraded. Case declined. As covered in the last chapter, that rejection left the investigation with nowhere left to go through conventional means. CODIS had returned nothing. Every traditional investigative avenue was closed. The one lab willing to attempt genealogy had just turned it away. Wright kept looking, and she found Othram, a private laboratory based in the Woodlands, Texas. Othram was not a general forensic lab. They had been built specifically to work on the cases other labs decline. Their proprietary method is called forensic-grade genome sequencing. It was developed for exactly this situation: biological samples that are degraded, contaminated, or nearly depleted, but still potentially viable if handled correctly. In February 2021, Wright contacted Othram and described the sample to them. They did not turn it away. They said, "We can try." Wright packaged up what remained of the evidence. She later described it as being down to the very last drops of anything usable. She sent it to Texas, and then she waited. What Wright did next, and what Othram found inside that sample, is something most people covering this case got wrong. Every episode on this channel is built from primary source material, forensic lab records, press conference transcripts, verified investigative timelines. We do not paraphrase, we do not speculate, we do not fill gaps with assumptions. If that standard matters to you, subscribe right now and hit the notification bell. Because what the results from that Texas lab revealed is something this case had never produced in 62 years of investigation. And you need to be here for it. Othram completed their analysis. Using forensic-grade genome sequencing, they extracted enough viable genetic material from what Wright had sent them to build a genealogical profile. That profile was run through an ancestry database. The search returned partial matches, distant relatives of the unknown contributor, people who had voluntarily uploaded their DNA, with no idea their family tree was about to surface in a homicide investigation. Genealogists went to work on those matches. They built the trees, they cross-referenced the records, they applied the geographic and age filters consistent with a male suspect in Spokane, Washington in March 1959, and the field narrowed down to three brothers, all deceased, all from Spokane. John Ray Hoff, James Andrew Hoff, Terry Allen Hoff. Three names. One of them had left his DNA on Candy Rogers's clothing in 1959, but forensic genealogy cannot distinguish between brothers. Their genetic profiles are too similar in a family tree structure to separate through ancestry database matching alone. To identify which of the three brothers, investigators needed something else. They needed a living biological relative. They went back through the records. Of the three Hoff brothers, only one had children. Only one path forward existed. Detective Stormont picked up the phone. He called a woman who had spent her entire life believing her father died because he was struggling. She had no idea that within 45 minutes she would walk into a police station already knowing what she was about to confirm. Detective Stormont made one phone call. On the other end was Kathy Hoff. She had spent her life believing her father died because he was struggling. Stormont identified himself as a cold case investigator. He told her he needed her help. Within 45 minutes, she was at Spokane Police Headquarters, but she did not walk in blind. After that call, she went online. She searched, and in that short window, she found the case. A 9-year-old girl, Spokane, 1959, Campfire Mints. By the time Kathy reached the station, she already understood what this might mean. She gave her DNA voluntarily. No delay, no argument, no hesitation. The results came back on September 8, 2021. The DNA recovered from Candy's clothing was 2.9 million times more likely to be related to Kathy Hoff than to a random person from the general population. That result pointed to one conclusion. Her father was the source of that DNA. But investigators were not finished. A relative match is powerful. A direct comparison is stronger. So they got a warrant. On September 23, 2021, they exhumed John Ray Hoff's body. The final comparison came back on October 1st. The probability that the DNA belonged to Hoff rather than an unrelated person was 25 quintillion to 1. That is 25 followed by 18 zeros. At that point, the case was no longer open. It had a name. John Ray Hoff was born on August 11, 1938. In Spokane, his own hometown. He was not a drifter, not a stranger, not passing through. He was local, known, familiar. In 1955, at age 16, he escaped from a state juvenile reform facility and was caught near Yakima. Later, he joined the U.S. Army. At 17, he was assigned to Nike missile sites near Fairchild Air Force Base. On March 6, 1959, he lived at 221 West Broadway Avenue. Candy lived on the 2200 block of West Mission Avenue. The distance between them, 1 mile. Then investigators found a connection that made the case even tighter. Hoff had a stable stepsister. She was 10 years old in 1959. She was a campfire girl. And she was Candy Rogers' assigned big sister in the program. She knew Candy. She cared about Candy. When Candy disappeared and Spokane was searching for her, that girl was devastated. She sat next to John Hoff and cried. She told him how much she missed her little campfire sister. He listened and said nothing. Then came the 1961 assault. 2 years after Candy's murder, Hoff was arrested in West Spokane. The charge was second-degree assault. According to investigators, he grabbed a woman, forcibly removed her clothing, tied her up using her own garments, and strangled her before fleeing. She survived. The method mattered. He used the victim's own clothing to bind her. He used the victim's own clothing to strangle her. That matched the evidence pattern from Candy's case. The 1961 victim survived because something interrupted him. Candy did not. Hoff served on 6 months. Just 6 months. John Ray Hoff died in 1970. He shot himself. The date mattered. It was his daughter's birthday. The day she turned 9 years old. The same age Candy Rogers was when she was killed. That answer died with him. Then investigators learned one more fact. 51 years. Hoff had been buried in the same cemetery as Candy Rogers. Same cemetery, same city. While her family visited her grave, the man identified through DNA lay in the same ground. When Hoff's family learned that, they made a decision, without being asked. They arranged to move his remains to a different cemetery. Candy's cousin Joanne, was overwhelmed when she heard it. Retired Captain Richard Obering was still alive to hear the answer too. He was one of the officers who found Candy in 1959. At the press conference he said, "I thank God that I lived long enough to see the end of this case." Detective Stormont was asked how many hours went into this case. He did not give a number. He said, "This isn't measured in hours. This is measured in careers." Candy Rogers was 9 years old. She wanted to earn a badge. She had a dog named Shep. She had a grandmother who gave her oatmeal cookies. She had a future that should have been hers. Instead, it was taken by a 20-year-old soldier who lived 1 mile away and was never once suspected. Still, 1,200 people showed up to find her. 3 generations of detectives refused to close her file. One forensic scientist sent one last sample to one last lab. And after 62 years, 8 months, 13 days, the clock stopped. Candy Rogers got her answer because one investigator in 1959 put evidence in a glass jar and sealed it shut. Right now, there are other cases sitting in evidence lockers, with biological material still waiting for the right lab and the right investigator to act. If that stays with you, subscribe to the Crime Testament. Now, because those are the cases we cover next, and one of them might already be waiting in your city.